carnival
You know,
kids in the
and-
arrow. And it like lifted the truck, spun it.
Yes,
It was
I've read several stories about people
the
that came up against someone.
tow truck driver and the police
and it was
get there and they're
nonviolent
like,
and
beer cans.
just kept killing them.
They were
Yeah.
beer
Nothing they could do.
Yeah, and with some people, that is their decision.
Yeah.
And I respect that. I read these stories. I
But
listen to
yeah,
them, and I think, you know, that would be honorable to be able to just
just
say,
these things.
okay, well, I give up my life.
You know? So I just tell
And yet,
Emma who's learning to
and
drive,
then
you have to go
you
slow.
read the stories
You
about
have
the
to
people who
assume
don't
that
just
other
come in and
people do
murder.
see you.
All right, should we go ahead and get started?
Horrible things. I'm not gonna
Let's
let
Yeah.
let's kick it off tonight. Actually, I took my phone's up there now. I'm realizing, and I had some notes that I wanted to start with tonight. So let me see if I can remember them. So one was just obviously, you know, like just with the craziness of our world that we've had this week. It's a good reminder that we always need to marry our what's called orthodoxy and orthopraxy, right? So the way we think, but also the way we live, and we need to like marry those two. And really, oftentimes in times of tragedy, in times of death, like that's when like the rubber starts meeting the road, right? With like how our theology matters and how we respond and how we think about death, and that sort of thing. That was one of them. One of them is if you were here. Another one was if you were here this morning. Was everybody here this? Anybody not here this morning? No, perfect.
I was in
so
children's church.
So Dustin gave a little parable about this idea of a fish swimming by some other fish and saying like, "Hey, the water is great," and one of the fish was like, "What is water?" Right? And it's the idea of like we often don't understand the context in which we swim in, and so what we're going to explore tonight is is in some ways a metaphor of that, because in the water that we swim in, we often don't look at the what's called the atonement theory that is kind of dominant within our society or our culture or within like evangelical circles, and so we're going to take a look at that theory tonight. So if you're anything like me and you were born like in a evangelical circle, this may be a paradigm shift or a challenge to the paradigm that you have. So just realize anytime we're presented with a conflict to our paradigm, right? Where we get like in the fight or flight. Yeah, we're resistant, we get in the fight or flight mode. You can leave here and not change your mind tonight, or you can change your mind, you know, who knows? But I just ask you, like, invite you to be open-minded. The other thing that I was gonna say is that we're talking about theories tonight. Atonements are theories, and so they're often based on like metaphor language. So we're kind of doing our best to interpret some of this stuff, but just it's okay to disagree, I guess is what I'm saying. It's okay for us to like walk away and disagree, and kind of keep the main thing. The hard part about this theory is like we're talking about like the cross, which is central, right? So with some of that, let's get into tonight, and then we'll kind of dialogue along the way. So we said that we are talking about these 4 different topics. The one we're going to be talking about tonight is the question of, did God kill Jesus? Yeah.
Do we have a handout?
I don't have a handout. Yeah, I can send one out in post. I spent the week like I thought I had it all like ready to go, and then like again like when I had talked to Dustin about some of the order stuff, my mind was like I got to revamp all, so I spent the week like twisting stuff around. So I have an order I can send out to you guys. Just I don't have it to hand out to you. So maybe I guess first of all, does that seem like an odd question? Did God kill Jesus?
Why? Oh, God killed Jesus.
Well, it's kind of like saying if you allow something to happen, are you responsible for it?
Okay.
So as a parent, if I watch another child throw a car at another child, am I letting that happen? Am I responsible?
So you're speaking to like the idea of causation versus like omission. Okay.
Well, I know when I was a young Christian, I was told that God was this judge, and Jesus was love, and for some reason, somebody had to die for this shedding of blood, and so, that was God's job, making sure that happened.
Okay.
He would be killing himself
That's a good
if
point.
he killed Jesus.
Yeah.
That was the reason why Jesus came to earth, though,
For God to kill him?
for him to die.
For him to die.
God sent him here for that purpose.
But he said he was willing.
Right.
Yeah, he had to be willing in order to have himself die on the cross. He didn't, the actual killing of Jesus was by man, but Jesus gave his life. It wasn't like he was going to resist. He could, it says, he could have called down 10,000 angels.
Right.
And everything would have stopped. But then we would have never known the Jesus that we know.
Good. You guys are pinging some of like the questions we're going to explore tonight. Okay. So this is kind of the question we'll ask is, did God kill Jesus, or does the death of Jesus expose human violence and reveal a God of nonviolence and self-giving love? Okay. We started last week with a meme. We'll start this one with as well. Let's see who finds it humorous and who doesn't.
Yeah.
So this is a meme against the atonement theory, penal substitutionary atonement, that we'll be talking about tonight. But it kind of gets at like the humor of this idea of like God sent himself to kill himself to save us from himself, right? Okay. So why did Jesus die on the cross? If we were to ask just somebody off the street or somebody in church, we might get a number of answers, right? So let's look at a couple of these. So maybe we might hear Jesus paid the price to set us free from the grip of sin and death. That Jesus beat the devil and all the evil powers by dying and rising. That Jesus made things right with God when we couldn't, restoring honor. That Jesus' death shows how much God loves us, so our hearts change and we start living like him. That he took the punishment for our sins that we deserved. That Jesus, the innocent one, took our blame or exposed our violence and ending it with mercy. Okay? So what we're going to talk about tonight is this idea of an atonement theory. Okay? And the word atonement is just an English word, and it was I believe first used in the King James Bible, and it's this idea of like, how does reconciliation happen between humanity and the divine? Okay? So a theory of atonement is a theological explanation of how Jesus' life, death, and resurrection restore the relationship between God and humanity, how humans are reconciled to God. So it asks questions about like, why did Jesus have to die? Or what is his death accomplished? Or how that brings salvation to sinners. Okay? One of the struggles with atonement theories is that the Bible uses many different metaphors, right? And metaphors can be stretched, but often if they're stretched too far, then they don't end up working in every aspect. Okay, so some of the metaphors that are used are sacrifice, ransom, victory, healing, example, adoption, and reconciliation. And so over history, Christians have come up with different models and theories of atonement. To ask this question, how does Jesus' death deal with sin and make us right with God? So since we're talking about this idea of violence, right? The cross is obviously a violent act. So concerning the use of violence, we'll ask, did God the Father act violently or orchestrate or use human agents to act violently against Jesus in order to forgive humanity? Okay, so here are 6 probably of the most dominant or popular atonement theories, and these are in historical order. I'll get to where they fall in history here, just the next one, but let's just run through them real quick. So the ransom theory says that Jesus' death, so if we were to ask the question, like, why did Jesus die on the cross? The ransom theory would say Jesus' death is a ransom that liberates humanity from bondage and sin to Satan. The question then comes when you start pushing this metaphor too far is, who is the ransom paid to? And so one of the early theories of ransom theory was the ransom was paid to Satan. And so it was this idea of like Jesus was like the Trojan horse that kind of went into death and like conquered death. But one of the struggles that Christians had was like, do we want to have like this theory of God like having to pay off Satan in order to make things work, right? The next one is the Christus Victor theory, which is that Jesus defeats the powers of sin and death and Satan to free humanity. Then there is the satisfaction theory, which happens with Anselm later on in history. So this is based off of like an honor-shame idea. So humanity's sin dishonors God, and Jesus has to come and restore God's honor by offering his obedient life. Then we have a moral example theory. Jesus' life is this practical example of sacrifice. The 5th one is penal substitution, which Jesus bears the punishment that sinners deserve, satisfying God's injustice so we can be forgiven. And all these have been pulled from, as you can see, different scriptures. And then the scapegoat theory, Jesus is the innocent victim of human violence whose death exposes the scapegoat mechanism, this idea that like we always want to like find somebody on the playground, right, and make them the weakest link so that we can feel better about ourselves by giving them a hard time, ultimately by like killing them and then burying the body and pretend like it didn't exist. So here's a snapshot of those theories and how, like, where they were developed historically. Okay, so we have ransom as the earliest, scapegoat is the latest. But the question we kind of want to look at is, as these theories are proposed, the question becomes, who does the violence in the theory? Okay, so in the ransom theory, it's Satan who is kind of in the background orchestrating the death of Jesus. In the Christus Victor theory, it's Satan's sin and death that killed Jesus. In the satisfaction theory, it's humans. And it's not until the 16th century and with John Calvin that we get this shift of responsibility of who killed Jesus. And Calvin's penal substitution proposes that God the Father killed Jesus. And then the scapegoat theory goes back to the humans. So really we're going to hone in on this, the penal substitutionary theory, because that's the one that really places the emphasis on God the Father acting against the Son. The rest of them do not. The satisfaction theory can take that mode, but it's primarily the penal substitutionary atonement theory that does, which, like, I'll just PSA for short. So that's the kind of the shorthand. This is also the primary model of atonement within like American evangelicalism. Just so like, so when we hear in part like how this is explained, for many of us it will feel like putting on a glove, like normal. As a historical note, the Eastern Orthodox Church has always rejected this view. It's never held this view. So just to show some of the...
What do they hold?
Yeah.
They would hold, that's a great question. it would probably be more of the largest view of the early church was a Christus Victor view, and many Anabaptists would say that is the primary view. So probably some combination of moral influence, Christus Victor. These aren't necessarily all like against each other. They can be like the facet of a diamond, right? So there's a lot of overlap because we're talking about the same thing. So some of these can work in conjunction with each other. The question is, how far, in a sense, do we want to push the metaphors? Okay. So before we get into some of the penal substitutionary theory, what I want to do is two things. One is I want to talk about, I want to center us always on Jesus, right? And so the two ways I'm going to do that as we begin to talk about this is we're going to talk about the narrative, right, of the story, and then we'll talk about what Jesus taught. And that'll be kind of like our centering point to kind of launch from where we go from there. Okay? So a narrative framing of who killed Jesus. So we're gonna play the clue, like who done it game, right? And just look at the Gospels, which often I think this is like the most common sense kind of way of looking at it, but we often overlook it and just kind of go straight to like proof texting theories. So this shouldn't come as any surprise. But if we start looking at that question, right? In the Gospels, we have Judas Iscariot, who betrays Jesus. We have the religious leaders who take part in arresting. We have the Jewish Sanhedrin, Pontius Pilate, who condemned him, the Jewish crowd who rejected him, Herod, who mocked him, and then the soldiers who crucified him, right? And in a sense, we have Satan working as the spiritual instigator underneath all of this, okay? So really the two, if we're gonna narrow it down to the two biggest groups, it would be the religious leaders and the Roman Empire, right? If we're gonna pin the tail on two different people, those would be the predominant parties, okay? And then, if we look at the book of Acts, the way the gospel, we use that word all the time, and it can often be confusing, but the way that the gospel is preached in the book of Acts is the common theme. There's a common phrase that's repeated in different formats in different ways, right? And the phrase is always, "You killed, but God raised." And so what is attributed to man is the killing of Jesus. What is attributed to God is the resurrection piece, right? And so we see that in all of these different sermons in the book of Acts, with Peter at Pentecost, at the temple, in the Sanhedrin, with Peter to Cornelius, with Paul, and then it just continues to pass on. Can't view my notes in this mode. It's interesting. Okay. So one pastor says this. He says, in reflecting on this, is that God did not kill Jesus. Jesus was killed by the principalities and powers, a term used by the Apostle Paul to describe the very powerful, the very rich, the very religious, the institutions they represent, and the spirits that operate within these institutions. Okay? So if we're just looking at the narrative, really it's humanity, it's us. It's humanity that kills Jesus, and it's different forms and facets. One other thing that I want to look at before we dive into this theory is just to home base us on Jesus's teaching. So let's begin with this question. What is forgiveness? That's not a rhetorical question, so you
I
can
think
answer.
it's acknowledging what somebody has done to you and saying, I'm not gonna hold a grudge against you.
Okay.
I think that's,
And never bringing it up again,
Burying the hatchet.
burying the hatchet.
Okay.
It's
What
the,
else?
it's the closest I think that people will ever come to being like Jesus on earth is when we forgive.
Okay. If you're explaining it to a fourth grader, how might you what's the definition of forgiveness for Sunday school?
look at me.
Restoring broken relationships.
Restoring broken relationships. That's good.
Is it though? I mean, not to put like, because I do think we can forgive, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to restore that relationship. I'm thinking like an abusive situation.
Yeah,
So you can forgive them, but I don't know that the relationship is restored.
yeah, I'm thinking more ultimate, with the whole mankind, Jesus broken.
On that level.
Yes.
Gotcha.
That's what I was thinking.
I think part of the word is forget. God forgets sin. When we confess sin, it's forgiven, but it's forgotten.
Okay.
How about on a human to human level though? Can you forgive someone and not forget?
Well, yeah.
If you've ever read some of Corrie ten Boom's stories about how this prison guard, when she was incarcerated and treated horribly, she was there in Germany preaching about God's forgiveness. And this prison guard, who was a horrible person and had become Christian, he said, Miss ten Boom, can you really forgive me? He was telling her he was sorry. And he was reaching out his hand to shake her hand, and she wanted to run away and scream, but she knew that God wanted her to shake his hand, so she did. And she said at that moment she just felt so free and happy and just filled with God's love. And I think that you have to have God's love in order to be able to really forgive.
Yeah.
Especially when you've really been hurt.
Okay. So here's another question. What is justice?
Depends on which side you're on.
It's good. Context matters. Yeah.
Paying a penalty.
Okay. Paying a penalty for what purpose?
I guess so that the person paying the penalty gets hurt by having to pay that penalty.
Okay. What's the
Justice atonement?
In restorative justice, paying the damage is part of the intention of restoring relationships.
okay?
It's a sign to the person who's been injured that you wish to have good relationships with that person. And so, it is one of the things you do in order to make the relationship whole again.
Okay.
Is you can forgive and can be forgiven. And then that the offender has a possibility of being a free person to be a good person again. Is not forever caught in the cycle of being the bad, punished one.
What is the American icon for justice?
Eye for eye, tooth for tooth.
The American flag.
What's the primary image for American justice?
Balance scale.
Right? And what is she wearing? Blindfold, right? So it's
Yeah.
a scale, but
Yeah.
it's an eye for an eye, it's a tooth for a tooth,
Right.
right? So you take $10 from me and you owe me $10, right? Which are like, in principle, it's kind of set out that way, but like it doesn't always necessarily work out that way in our justice system, right? Like sometimes the person paying the penalty pays a way more severe penalty than like what's due. You know, we could argue like how much is speeding like worth, like how much, you know, the ticket. There's going to be all sorts of debate with like this Charlie Kirk thing about the, you know, the death penalty. And so, you know, but the American icon for justice is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Okay, let's look at a couple things that Jesus taught. So Jesus is teaching on forgiveness, justice, and responsibility. So Jesus' definition of forgiveness is that it's a release of debt. Okay, so he says in the Lord's Prayer, "Forgive us as we have been forgiven." Right? He heals the paralytic and he bypasses the temple mechanics. Right? The temple mechanics was to go and offer a sacrifice. Okay? In the parable of the unforgiving servant, we have this massive release of debt, right? It's like this huge debt, and then what does the unforgiving servant do, right? He goes back and he's like trying to find a way to scrap up money unjustly, right? After he's been forgiven this massive debt. And then we have perhaps one of the most famous ones, and we spent that time in the book here, the idea of the prodigal son, right? And this one probably hits home the most because it's got like familial ties and narrative to it, and so we can kind of understand, like all of us can understand like what it's like to be the prodigal and to, you know, take our inheritance and squander it. And what the father doesn't do is he doesn't demand that the son comes back and works and restores all of that. No, he does the opposite of that. He lavishes on him the restoration of his position as an heir, like not error, but you know, like someone who's going to be getting the inheritance. Yeah, and which you know, as you can imagine, would piss off the older son, which it seems to in the story. Okay, justice in Jesus' teaching, justice is restorative. The purpose of justice is restorative. So Jesus overturns this retributive logic of an eye for an eye, or a tooth for a tooth, and he uses restorative type language. He also doesn't condemn. So we have the story of the woman caught in adultery, right? And so he points out this idea of like, look, everybody has a log in their own eye. Everybody has sinned. And so, like, we're not gonna his justice is a release of her debt, and then it's restoring her back to the community, right? It's not a retributive type of justice. So we have the parable of the lost sheep. So God's joy is in restoring the lost, not punishing them. And then the parable of the Good Samaritan, again, justice is defined as compassion and restoration into the family. Okay, and then this idea of responsibility, right? So responsibility lies with the individual. There was an idea within Jewish thoughts that you could be responsible for the sins of your parents, right? And when confronted with that idea, when Jesus heals somebody, Jesus says, like, this guy didn't sin and his parents didn't sin. You guys are misunderstanding the situation, right? And so it was this idea of like, oh, like the person was help me out, I can't remember, what was it? Was it a paralytic, or was it
It was a man born blind.
Born blind, thank you. This idea that like the man was born blind because of some type of generational sin, right? So Jesus also says things that identify like our own responsibility for what we've done and not for others. So he says stuff like your words will justify or condemn you. Direct accountability for your actions, or servants are judged according to their own knowledge and their actions. Okay, this becomes important, and we'll get into PSA, but one more thing before that is there's this idea called the myth of redemptive violence, right? And this is part of the code in the matrix that we live in. And it's been around since the beginning, and it's very easy, like once you see it, it's one of those things that you can't unsee, right? But it's the idea that peace comes through violence. So try to watch a movie or a TV show, right, without seeing this idea. I mean, the kind of pinnacle of this is like all of our superhero movies and shows where it's like the superhero has to use violence to save the day, right? And so it's this idea that violence is what saves. The evil must be defeated through violence. It was this idea, the myth of redemptive violence, that term was originally coined by a theologian called Walter Wink. And he said it's the dominant religion of our time. It's not Christianity or Islam or secularism, but it's the worship of this idea that salvation comes through violence, that only violence can save. Okay, he traces this. Yeah.
I just have a question about Islam. I don't know if anybody knows or not. Does Islam embrace violence? I mean, I know that they have fundamentalists. You know, Christianity has fundamentalists too.
Yeah, it would be just like Christianity. It would depend on the stream, whatever stream,
okay.
Right? Like you could ask that about Christianity, and like
some people would say it does, and some people say it doesn't.
Okay.
What does the Quran say?
I do not know.
I've been looking at that a bit lately. The Quran, basically, if you're not a person of the book, in other words, a Christian or a Jew, you can be eliminated.
You can be what?
Eliminated.
Okay.
Yeah, I've read that too.
Okay.
So that's why the fundamentalist groups who harken back to the Quran say to behead infidels is fine, but it's backed up by the Quran.
Right. Which again, I mean, like we take it to our own. Like that justification was used in the Crusades. So it's like, Wink traces this idea all the way back to the Babylonian creation myth called Enuma Elish, and the idea that creation was founded on this idea of violence. But if we look at modern forms, right, it's in our movies, the hero must kill the villain to save the world. It's in our politics, we must go to war to protect our freedom. It's in our policing, harm or suppression of the bad guys ensures peace, and it's in our religion. God needs to violently punish sin through Jesus. So Wink critiques this idea, and he says that Jesus directly challenges and refuses this myth by absorbing the violence and not by returning it. So Jesus comes into the world and he subverts this myth through absorbing the violence and through coming back through resurrection. So he says, in summary, the cross is not about God using violence to save us, but it's about God exposing and overcoming the cycle of violence through love, suffering, and resurrection. Wink calls Jesus' death the ultimate act of nonviolent resistance to the myth of redemptive violence. So we see this in the Gospels, right? So redemptive violence would say strike back. Jesus says turn the other cheek. Redemptive violence would say kill your enemies. Jesus says love your enemies. Redemptive violence would say live by the sword. Jesus says you'll die if you use the sword. Redemptive violence says the violence saves. Jesus says Father forgive. Okay? Why this matters is because the myth underlines empires, wars, racism, cycles of revenge. It influences how we interpret the cross, and so we'll get into that here now. Is the violence done on the cross so that God saves us, or is God's self-giving love that unmasks this lie of violence? Very different ways of looking at the cross. So the myth of redemptive violence is the lie that violence is a legitimate and necessary way to make the world right. The gospel offers a radical alternative, redemptive love, not redemptive violence. Okay? So I'm going to offer you this paradigm shift. This has been a radical paradigm shift for me, and it in a sense kind of goes against the way that I was raised, because I was raised in a form of evangelical church. And so you can just invite you to think about the difference between these two perspectives of the cross tonight. And we're going to kind of talk about that as we go here. So the question is, did Jesus die on the cross as a sacrifice in order for God to forgive? Or did Jesus die on the cross as a sacrifice to show how God forgives? Okay, home base, just recognize that like both sides of this coin are saying Jesus died on the cross as a sacrifice and that God forgives. Right? The question is, the paradigm shift is, was that necessary in order for God to forgive, or was that a demonstration of how God forgives? Very, very small word shift, but a dramatic impact.
Huge difference.
Yeah.
I think it was to show how God forgives.
Okay. So what we're going to talk about is the predominant view, penal substitutionary atonement, says the first one, that Jesus had to die in order to forgive. Okay. So here is the penal substitutionary theory and what it teaches. And like I said, this is the water we swim in many ways, so this is going to probably sound somewhat familiar. So it teaches that because of our sin, we deserve punishment, which is the penalty, but that Jesus took our place, so that is the substitution, so that we could be reconciled to God. So that is the atonement. All right? So key elements of PSA are that God requires punishment. So because God is perfectly holy and just, all sin must be punished. God's justice is portrayed as retributive. Wrongdoing must be repaid with suffering or death. Humanity deserves divine wrath. So every person has inherited both the guilt and corruption of Adam's original sin, total depravity. Again, this comes from Calvin. As a result of all humans are born under God's condemnation and deserving of eternal punishment. And Jesus is the substitution on the cross. Jesus takes the penalty for our sins, suffering in our place. His death satisfies God's wrath so that those who trust in him can be declared righteous. Last one, the result, legal justification. So the sinner's guilt is transferred to Jesus, and his righteousness is transferred to the believer. This is often described in the courtroom language, as in courtroom language. The guilty are declared innocent because someone else has served their sentence. Okay?
Can you?
Want to go back to
No.
Oh, okay. I was trying to hide that.
No. Oh.
I'm gonna come back to the
Okay.
note. Yeah, that's a
That's
fun.
where I was going.
That's a fun one. I have a whole academic article. If you like that note, I got an
No, I
academic.
love Walter Wink, so.
I got an academic article for you on that question. Any initial thoughts on any of these? Anything stick out? Anything you're like, oh, I like that, or that sounds familiar, or definitely not that?
That sounds like the basic instruction that I got as a young kid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, really.
Me too.
It's simple. You know, when raising a kid, or when I was being raised, you do something wrong,
Yeah.
you paid your penalty, you're good. And that's kind of how we viewed God. Somebody had to die for all our sin,
Mm-hmm.
and it's been paid for, so we're good.
Just skips all the love stuff.
It seems very Old Testament,
now
right?
that I, as an older person
Yeah.
looking at this is how, in my early days, this is what I was taught.
Yeah.
But now I can stand back and I think I understand God's nature a little better. And I'm looking at this going, where's the love?
This is
Black
more
Eyed
like,
Peas song.
This is
more like
corporate.
what you're saved from, not what you're saved to.
Yes.
We're saved from God's wrath and punishment, but then is that it? Is there more after we're saved from God's wrath and punishment? What are we called to and saved to?
Good question.
It seems very Old Testament,
Okay.
like the view from the Old Testament. Yeah.
Along with what Gary was saying, isn't everything up there based on God's love for us? Or are we under God's love before we accept Christ?
So yeah, this view would say you're under God's wrath until you accept Christ.
Right.
Yeah.
I would like to go up over what Sue said. Can you bring that me back up again?
I can, yeah. Give me a second. Let's look through here. Yeah.
For myself, I would like to see that bottom line say to save us for himself, not from himself.
Okay.
Just my personal opinion.
Okay. But you're okay with the first phrase?
Sacrifice himself too.
To me, that shows the vicious circle
Yeah.
that we get in,
Yeah.
that we can get ourselves into. He sacrificed himself to save us from him sacrificing us. You know, it's kind of a vicious circle. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But if he created the world, then did he not create the idea that there's a penalty for your sin? That, you know.
Okay, so let me bring up just a quick, this is a rabbit hole that I'll introduce, and if you would like to chase this, I have an academic article for you to read. But it's one of, I think, the problems that we initially hit when we start talking about this theory. Okay, and this is often neglected. The irony in this issue being raised is that the academic article argues along these lines, and the guy that's doing it is a Calvinist that's doing it, which is just beautiful to me. But he can do it because of a couple different reasons, and we could get into that if we want. But so one issue often neglected with this view is that this view says that Jesus suffered the penalty of death, while most advocates of this view believe that the unrepentant sinner will suffer eternity in hell. So if this is the case, Jesus' substitution, right, he's taking on of the penalty, is not the same as the punishment for the unrepentant. Does that make sense? So if I say, Jesus died for me so that I don't have to suffer eternity in hell, how do we match Jesus's temporal death with 3 days in the grave with eternal conscious torment? Right? It's not a one-to-one correlation for substitution. Does that make sense? Okay, so but nobody ever talks about that issue. What the way that's kind of whitewashed is Jesus is an infinite being, and so he's able to infinitely absorb all of the sins somehow into himself, but you just can't, you have to do infinite math type of thing, right, to try to justify it. It's an issue that the theory has to wrestle with.
But some people believe that time that Jesus spent in the grave was in hell.
Right.
So that he would know.
But you still have a temporal substitution for an eternal one.
Okay.
So it's still not a one-to-one. So the issue is the one-to-one comparison.
Oh,
right?
okay.
It's not equal substitution.
Yeah, I gotcha.
Okay. All right. So as your worship pastor, this is one of the things that I struggle with personally, because I think a lot of worship pastors don't look at the theology of stuff that we sing. I have the problem.
I can tell you, he does.
I have the problem of overdoing that part, and so there's often songs where I'm and I believe me, I struggle with some of the songs that we sing. So I'm singing it, and I'm not I don't like this language, but sometimes songs are popular, and we'll get to it. But let me just give you a couple examples of PSA in worship. Okay, so in Christ alone, the wrath of God was satisfied. God's wrath against sin was satisfied in Jesus' death. Oh, come to the altar. This is a newer song. It says forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus, so it was paid for, which is classic substitution payment framing. Man of sorrows, the sin of man and the wrath of God on Jesus was laid. Okay, but it's not just modern worship songs. This is like all over like hymns as well. So 2 examples, right? Jesus paid it all. Sin had left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. So Jesus pays what sinners owed and cleansed through his atoning death, or nothing but the blood. What can wash away my sins? So this idea of a payment, right? Okay. This helps put it in perspective. I think these are direct quotes from advocates of this position. Okay. So God did not spare his own son because it was the only way he could spare us. If God were not just, there would be no demand for his son to suffer. And if God were not loving, there would be no willingness for his son to suffer. But God is both just and loving, so his love is willing to meet the demands of his justice.
Yeah.
Okay, here's another one. The most violent expression of God's wrath and justice is seen in the cross. If we stagger at the wrath of God, let us stagger at the cross. That's R.C. Sproul. Okay, Christ's death was penal in that it bore a penalty when he died. His death was also a substitution, and then he was a substitute for us when he died. Another one from Sproul. The Father's wrath was poured out on Jesus because of sin was laid upon him, and God could not tolerate sin. Christ stood in our place. He was our substitute. He took the punishment we deserved. Last one. The cross is the moment when the righteous judgment of God is satisfied through the willing sacrifice of his Son for the purpose of reconciling sinners to himself. Okay? So, obviously, like it's a Christian position, so it's going to have hopefully some scriptural support or frequently cited passages, right? So proponents of this view often draw from Isaiah 53, the idea of he was pierced for our transgressions, the punishment that brought us peace was on him. From Romans, God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement to demonstrate his righteousness. 2 Corinthians, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us. Galatians, Christ redeemed us for the curse by becoming a curse for us. Just a quick fun Anabaptist note. What's absent from that list of scripture?
Say that again.
What's absent from that list of scripture? I'm just looking at it going, is there anything from the Gospels in there?
No, it's all letters.
Okay. So here's kind of the comparison that I want to draw is the left side would be the PSA view, and the right side is what I presented to you from the Gospels. Okay, so the left side says that forgiveness is a payment of debt. So they would quote Hebrews, which says, "Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins." Jesus sides with the prophets on this, and he says, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice." And so the question we're asking here is if there is a payment that is made, does forgiveness really occur? Or is that just justice? Right? That's kind of the big picture question we're asking there. Right? Like if Emma steals $10 from me,
It wasn't
I
me.
know it was you, right? And I demand $10 back from her. That requires no forgiveness. That's justice, right? Forgiveness would be like, hey Emma, I know you stole my $10 and you spent it on Slurpees. but
What it's supposed to be.
but I'm gonna forgive you and not demand the debt back. Right? So that's kind of the question we're asking is, does forgiveness, how does debt come into play with this idea of forgiveness? Okay? PSA on the left side would say that justice is retributive. So this idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right? So you're allowed to harm someone equally back as you have been harmed. But Jesus overturns that idea and he says, you have heard it said, but I say to you. Okay? And what we see, I would argue, in Jesus' ministry is always restorative justice. So it's absorbing the debt and then it's trying to restore that person into a right standing in the community. All right, and then the third idea is this idea of responsibility is transferable, right? So like I can go rob a liquor store and get arrested, and because Emma loves me so much, she can be like, hey, look, I know you're gonna spend those 3 months in jail, but like it's cool, you go home and I'll go spend the 3 months in jail for you, right? So this idea of like, can I transfer, like, can a guilty party transfer their wrongdoing onto someone else, right? Which